Institute needs no introduction, but I'll give a couple of things about Azim Premji School of Education. It is one of the first programs that have started in PISS Hyderabad since 2011. It offers programs in education at the master's, MPhil and PhD levels. We also had a basket course in education for BA in Social Sciences, which was an integrated program. So this module encouraged students at a very early stage to take up issues of education and could pursue it till the higher level. So, and a little bit about uh, the uh, why we thought that Tarabai Modak's name would be appropriate to get initiated into this first series of lecture series that we call. You would perhaps get more about Padma Bhushan Tarabai's work and her involvement in education. But just to carry a glimpse of the kind of work that she has done earlier. So Tarabai Modak was born in 1892, passed away in 1973. She was born in Mumbai, at that time Bombay. She graduated from University of Bombay in 1940, and later she became the principal of a women's college in Rajkot. She worked closely with Vijubai Badeka, and later on she developed Balwadis in Modi, a coastal village in Thane district of Maharashtra, which was called Nutan Bal Shikshan Sangha. She was awarded Padma Bhushan in 1962 for her work in preschool education. And we also know Anutai Wagh, who has been closely working with Tarabai Modak on preschool education. So we felt that it would be really good to have the name of Tarabai to this lecture series. A little bit about the organizations that have been uh, uh, jointly working with us. The Barefoot Philosopher is an initiative which was started by Professor Sundar when he was at NIAS, but it was about taking philosophy to the larger fold of the society and engaging them with issues that relate to philosophy at a more intense level. Uh, this also attracted, I mean, it is hoped that it will attract a lot many people to enter and engage with the philosophical ideas that one encounters. Cadence Institute of Excellence, as I have spoken about, is working in the sector of social empowerment, and it also reaches out to a large set of community of people with its educational initiatives. And one such initiative was this lecture series. The idea first came from Cadence and Barefoot Philosophers, and when we had discussions, we realized that the scope could be expanded, and we could have many more individuals interested to be on the same platform. A little bit about Professor Sundar Sarukai. He has been a professor in philosophy at NIAS, Bangalore. However, he is now actively working with Barefoot Philosophers. His work is primarily in the field of philosophy of natural and social sciences. He has been an author on several books and editors on several books. Uh, he is also the series editor for the Science and Technology Studies series of Routledge. And his, like I said, Barefoot Philosophers is one initiative which he's constantly been engaging and seeing to it that philosophy reaches into the public domain. So that has been, I mean, I would like to, uh, you know, complete this introduction and hand over the platform to Sundar so that we can have an active dialogue with Sundar. But just before handing it over to Sundar, I would like to express my thanks to Tata Institute of Social Sciences, our backend support, Mr. Devansh, and also our student Elsa, who helped design the poster. So it's because of the active support of my colleagues and the institutional support that we have been able to reach out to you all and have an overwhelming response. We hope to continue and sustain this effort further as well. Over to Sundar, and I'll request all the participants to kindly turn off the video so that we can maximize on the bandwidth. And if you have any queries, perhaps you can put down in the group chat. Even if we are unable to take up the question, we'll collate the text together, the questions together, and share it with Professor Sundar, and we can take up in the later discussions or take it at a later point. Thank you all. Sundar, please.
Thank you. Yeah, Ritesh, can you hear me?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah.
You are
okay.
audible.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, Ritesh, and hello to all of you. It's a great pleasure and honor to give this talk on in the name of Tarabai Modak Memorial. It's always, I think, inspiring to find education, especially people who have been fighting against the domain to engage with our education system. So I'm extremely happy that I have had this opportunity to share these ideas. As they saying, this particular theme was chosen for a variety of reasons. I must thank Karen and Dr. Mufida, whom said that we continue our earlier workshops which we have done with Cadence, this time on Science and Society, given what was happening with the COVID situation. And then we thought we should probably do it as a webinar. And then Dr. Anu Joy, who's at TIFR, who's a science educationist, had invited me to give a talk at TIFR, which was on sociality of science. And then we thought with Anu's help that maybe we should develop this further into this particular course. So I'm very grateful to Anu, Mufida, and Ritesh for making this possible, and to all of you for joining us to think through this particular question. Okay. I've tried to share one of my slides, but I don't know if people are able to see it because I'm not able to see my my face in Zoom, etc. Okay, now I can see it. Okay, I'll try the sharing again, but it doesn't matter because I'll be reading. I mean, I'll just try and read parts of it. I just want to make sure that you're able to see this. I'm not able to see this. Okay, change to. Okay, I have to say Zoom share. Sorry, just give me 1 second. I think because I did share it beforehand, but I don't know why it has not come on screen for all of you. Are you able to see the shared screen I sent you?
Yes, sir.
You were, is it?
Yes, sir. We can see your share screen, sir.
Okay. Okay. Great. So
please put it on the slide.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
I'll just put it on the slide and.
Absolutely fine.
We are all ready to. Yeah. Okay. We are all ready to go. So yeah, this is a theme which I think is absolutely necessary for us to think about today for a variety of reasons. I know we have all been engaging with it in recent times, probably because of some aspects of questions around the COVID, but I want to look at it in much more different context. I want to look at it in terms of how we can even understand this question. So I want to ask this question about what does the science and society actually mean? So over the course of this 8 lectures, what I want to do is I want to break up this theme into smaller topics, which I think is of interest to a lot of us. For example, the question of science and religion has always been an extremely important question, both in the history of science and also in the philosophy of science. So it has also been an extremely important question for non-Western cultures which engage with societies which are also very religious. So what is this so-called conflict about science and religion? What does it actually entail? What is that kind of a conflict which is present? And how does that translate into questions related to society? So, for example, I want to deal with that as a separate lecture topic on one day. I also want to look at science and education because when you talk about society, since I'm going to refer quite a bit to the Indian situation, the question of the influence of ideas of science and science education on our larger education system is very profound. And we need to understand what is this history of this education which has led to certain kind of emphasis on science education, and what exactly would science education actually mean. And since education is a very integral part of what we would call as a social good, something which a society needs and demands of its people, for its people, there's an extremely strong relation between science and education. I want to see how we can think through that in a little more complexity. I also want to look at the relationship between science and the state separately, because very often it is a state patronage of science which dictates what the way in which science develops in many places. There are very important changes in it, but in the Indian context, it's still the state patronage which is very dominant. And what does this imply? What does this imply when you have a democratic society in different parties are elected to power? So you have different governments, and you have a particular kind of a relationship between the scientific institution and scientists as practitioners of science and the larger state. So how do we understand the many different kinds of deep questions which come from it? So I want to look at it a little bit historically also, and then situate it in the context of India. Another important theme which I will talk about is science and Marxism. Again, very important for the Indian context, because there is a very strong relationship, and Marxism has a lot invested in a particular idea of science. And in whether it's the classical Marxism or neo-Marxism or variations of it, there's a very strong commitment to some particular ideas of science. And in India, much of the debate on many of the people who have been involved with, for example, the adult education movement, science education movement, the scientific temper movements, rationality movements, have also been from the left. So I want to look at it in the larger notions of the left and science, and look at the relationship between the kinds of strength which science and Marxism have between each other, and the kinds of tensions which also arise between them. And of course, again, given the Indian context, I'd be very interested to look at what constitutes the relationship between science, caste, and gender. And I think particularly in the Indian context, we need to find ways to talk about it. So what I'm going to be doing in all these lectures is do an exercise in philosophical thinking, like I do with all my philosophy courses. I want to think with you. If it was a larger class, we could think together and where we could hear each other. But unfortunately, in this particular medium, I still hope and believe that we can think together as I'm talking about certain ideas, and I give some examples. And as Ritesh has said, we could have a more dynamic interaction when you send in your comments and questions, etc. And we can work with those questions over the next 4 weeks, pick up points which interest you, try and answer some of these points, or point you to relevant literature and so on. So science, caste, and gender is going to be an extremely important question in the context of a relationship between science and society in the Indian context. So I will look at it a little more carefully. And there are a couple of other points I'll also pick up in some other themes as we go along, depending on your interest. But there are a couple of other issues which I would definitely look at. One separately as the relationship between scientific rationality and what we could call as a rationality of the social. And this is, again, a very important point. I'll make some comments on it in the first session today. So it's also very interesting, because when we talk about what is it to be rational and what is the model of rationality, and how can a society function in a rational context, it will be useful to understand the meaning of rationality and what is special to scientific rationality, what is special to the rationality of social systems, and so on. And of course, I will begin with the introductory talk today on science and society, and also depending on how our questions go, etc. In the next session, I will talk a little more about philosophy of science, so we have a better idea of what is it that we are talking about when we talk about this idea called science. So basically, what I'm trying to do here is to set up a series of questions and concepts by which we can think through together, try and mine them, try and go deeper into looking at their different ways of meaning that they could have. So I'm not as interested to make judgments on anything or to make comments about the practice of science or what is happening in society, etc. I mean, they will always be there as part of the side discourse. The minor discourse will always contain that. But I want to see, okay, everybody says science and society is very important. There are many programs on called Science and Society. If I remember right, the Indian National Science Academy also has a separate program called Science and Society. So I suppose they're all, in some sense, worried about this question. There are independent programs which have, separate syllabus and so on. There are many places which have been trying to build programs in Science and Society. So I suppose it is important in some sense, right? So instead of trying to look through all the material, look at all the text they talk about, let me start with a very simple question. And this is what I mean by doing a simple philosophical exercise with you, which is to look at the question as a relationship between science and society. And what could this relation actually mean? What do we mean by saying there is a relation between science and society? Because science is something, and we'll try and clarify what it is, and society is something else. And the problem with the word science and society, like very commonly used words, and this is a question about language, is that they are used across domains. They're used by people they may be implying very many different things, but all of us may be saying the same word. So when somebody tells you be scientific, or the Indian population is not scientific, or something like that, there are very many different meanings which is implied when they use the word science. And science is also used in a technical sense, just like society is used in a technical sense by sociologists and others. So when a scientist talks about science, they have a pretty good idea what they talk about, and they know what they are saying, what they are doing. But when it is used in a public space, when it is used for people who are not within that specialized domain, there could be many different kinds of meanings. And part of the source of the constant tension between science and society lies in this ambiguity between the terms of science and the ambiguity in the meanings of the words science and society. So let me, in this session, let's try and unpack this and clarify this, open it out in different ways and see whether we can get a better handle about it. And as I said, I want to do this exercise as just thinking about this relation, which means I have no position to take on that right now. Maybe at the end of the few lectures, we may all share positions we may have on this. I just want to say, well, people say there's a relation between science and society. I want to think about it. How do I go about it? And I want to go beyond good or bad. I don't want to start by saying the relationship is good. We should not have, the scientific societies are not humanistic, or humanistic societies are not rational, etc. So this judgment is not really in the purview of what I begin with today. So the first question then you can ask is, why should we even think about this question? Why does it matter for me to say that there's a relation between science and society? Why should all of us who are not scientists, who are not in the government, let's say, who are not involved in making policies, why should we think about it? And here is why I think the question of science and its relation to the public is so important. It is a fact that scientific communities, like other professional communities, you could think of musicians, for example, very different on the other side of the spectrum, or actors or theater people, for example. So these are also professional communities. These are also specialized communities. But one could say scientific community is also one such. It may be bigger than some of these communities, but it is also one such community where there are people who, if you enter into science institutes, you can watch what they do, how they do it. And like the famous work by Latour and Woolger points out, you can study scientists like tribals, look at our communities, look at what they do, look at their rituals, look at their practices, look at what they do, and so on. So why should we, the others who are outside this specialized group of scientists, why should we worry about what scientists are doing and how it affects society. Now, there's obviously a simple, so I'm rehashing many things which you might know now, but this is just to set the base for a common dialogue between us, right? So we could say one very good reason why we should think about this relation is because unlike other communities, there is an enormous amount of power invested in the scientific community. And these are powers that shapes societies. And this is not just about science. Any community, for example, it could be a very rich financial community. It could be, the billionaires, the extremely small minority of billionaires around the world who seem to have a disproportionate influence on many of us who are not part of their universe. So we are, all of us, as recipients of the power, recipients of the effects of the power that certain groups wield, all of us have a stake in it. All of us have to have a say in it. We have a stake in it because it is about deciding who we want to be. And this is something which is, it's a larger question about societies and not really about science. It's about this very interesting fact about what constitutes a society. And let's work with a very zeroth order definition, right? Like all of us belong to a society. So let's say that all of us who are individuals, we belong to a society. And all of us belong to a society, but all of us unequally belong to society. We do not equally belong in the sense that people who have certain kind of power have greater access to many things in society. You can start with the politicians who can call a policeman at one, they want to do something, they can just give a phone call, they'll have hundreds of people running to their house. You can start from there and go down the line to the other more privileged classes who can send their children to very good schools or who are not really as affected as COVID as many of the other migrant laborers were, and you could go down. But in a sense, in the true sense of the word social and society does not discriminate between the poorest migrant and the richest chief minister of a state. That is the ideal. A subject of a state is not distinguished as a subject, but can be distinguished based on other social values, including values of gender, caste, class, and so on. And we know that very well. But this question is actually a question of democracy, about asking how much power do we have, each one of us, many of us who may be insignificant in the power play of the society, how much of a say do we have in deciding who we want to be? And this is actually played out in a very interesting way, in a parallel, analogous way with nations. Many times when we talk about development and the development of technologies, for example, it is not decided on what the other nations who are down the hierarchy want. Very often, the decision on the kind of technologies which we have is inherited. It's given. It's a one-way flow which comes to us, and we as a nation just absorb it, take it up, and make do with it all the time. We find cultural adapters, just like if you get a 110 volts, let's say, an appliance from the US which works on 110 volts, and then you come here, you get this 110 to 220 volt adapter and put it in and run the machine here. We do cultural adaptation in similar ways for many of the technologies that we receive. But how much of an autonomy and choice and decision do we have as a nation? I'm not talking of all the citizens. Do we have, as a nation, have in deciding what kind of technologies are important to us? What kind of technologies are not important to us? So it is that same point about the ideal of a democratic society, which is about deciding who we want to be. And this is, of course, related to the question of whose vision of humanity and the world are we all really following today? To put it in a melodramatic fashion, and I don't think we should take it in that sense immediately, we can keep it in the back of our mind. Is it this Mark Zuckerberg's vision that is driving our daily lives today? Is it his and his bunch of, you know, teenage, let's say very um, obviously very intelligent people around him who have a vision for how society should be ordered, how society should function, how we should live within our house and have built technologies which can get everybody to come to our house, or to build technologies in which the whole world appears in my screen rather than me stepping out into the world and engaging with the world. There's nothing wrong. I'm not entering into the discussion of whether this is right or wrong. As I said, this is not about good or bad. But I want to know who chose this? Whose vision is it that we should have societies where anybody, any child who decides to say, this is a song I want to listen to, or this is a movie I want to listen to at this time, when I want, what I want, that we should actually enable it. Technology should enable it. It may be, obviously, when people talk about technology, it often gets down to, oh, this digital technology is so good, that is so bad, etc. Again, let's try and avoid that. Let's try and see what are the implications to us. How do we think about this beyond that binary? And one of the ways to ask is, whose vision of humanity is really driving much of the way a society develops? So these are questions not about technology, but societies. It is about what happens to us as individuals. It's about the definition of being human. And that's a good enough reason for us to actually think much more seriously about the relationship between science and society, as compared to many of the other kinds of professional small communities which are present. And we see this enormously around us today. If I know that many Indian scientists feel that there should be much more support from the government, and I totally accept it. And I've always said it. We have brilliant scientists in India, and I think the problem with Indian science is not in the quality of or some of the best minds who work in a very difficult field. Working in science is difficult. I'm sure all of you know that. Working in any academic discipline has its own difficulty, just like any other profession. So I don't want to valorize academic profession, but scientific profession is difficult. It demands a lot of sacrifice. It demands a lot of other kinds of engagement. We'll talk a little bit about that later, because there are very important notions of practice of science and so on. But so we know that this is a profession which is extremely difficult to follow, very competitive. I think far more competitive than most of the fields that you will see. And it is, so given all that, one could say, as an Indian scientist would say, that, look, the state has to support science to a great extent. And that's what India does, the Indian government does. But Indian scientists always feel that money is not enough and that you need a lot more money, because doing science has also become very expensive. It's not like what it was decades ago. If you want to be competitive in science, do so-called cutting edge research in science, especially with experimental science, you need enormous amount of money. So we understand all that. But within the context of India, we also realize that at the same time, compared to science, the other disciplines get nothing. They get a pittance. There has been a complete negation of the development of social science disciplines within India. And as I always keep saying, there is not a single dedicated institute of humanities in India, which I think reflects very, very poorly on any notion of a nation or civilization. But that has not really got to do with science per se. That's a different kind of priorities, which when we talk about education, we can talk about it. So I'm saying that the group of scientists who run Indian science today, or are participants in this Indian science, also have a very important role in the public domain, in the larger social domain. And for many of them, this is an extremely important question, which has often been raised by philosophers and historians of science. And as recently in a very interesting piece by Stephen Schaffen on the idea of trust, and how the questions of trust has actually changed over time, and that there are new challenges to the practice of science today, especially after A lot more private players have come into science, and there's been a lot more commercialization of scientific knowledge in various ways. I mean, since we don't, I must also say this beforehand without sounding too much like a complaint, although it probably is that, when it's very ironic that India, which has the second or the third largest number of scientists and technologists in the world, a huge manpower resource in the country, we do not have a dedicated institute, not one, I mean, not many, not even one, I'm saying, on to our programs to do science studies in India. There are no history of science and philosophy of science institutes. You can see this in small countries around the world where there are independent institutions in which you have social scientists, you have historians, philosophers, and others reflecting on the practice of science in that society. And in India, it's extremely interesting that when such an initiative happens in a very small way, it'll happen within the scientific community. And that's, it says something very important about the politics of science, which I may or come back to much later. So the question of trust has always been an extremely important part of science. It's a very important scientific virtue, because without trust, there is no possibility of science to exist within a social world. Why? Because, as I said, science is a very specialized community act. It's a very professional, they have their own language, they have their own ways of constructing evidence, etc. And so when they say that there is something like a quark, you will need, you can't go to them and say, a person on the street, the so-called lay person, cannot go and say, hey, tell me, what do you mean? Show me this quark. I would also like to see it. If you're so sure that it is there, how do you show that to me? And that is not possible because they can't even show it to the other scientists. So forget about showing it to the lay person. It's a far more complicated, sophisticated way of seeing the world. It needs training in perception. Science is not about just seeing the world. It's about showing you how to see the world. And there is nothing automatic about seeing. So the training to see the world is one way in which we can understand instrumental perception, what science says they see through all these big instruments. But at the end of it, it is about trust. You'll have to say, well, I trust these scientists. They know what they are saying. If they say they have seen a quark, I'm going to accept what they say. And this is always a very difficult question because, when you have major developments, discoveries like quarks and stuff like that, maybe, we can try and understand what they're saying because there are various ways of evidencing that, showing what they have seen, etc. But science is not just about discovering quarks. There's very little of science which is just about discoveries. It's not like scientists sit every day and find one great thing to show us. The everyday science is a very, it's a very difficult, nitty-gritty job of doing something. At the end of the day, they may not have found something new or solved something. It is a part of a process which may take months. In some cases, it may take years. So in all that, there is a notion of trust that what they are doing is something which is important, and eventually they will probably tell us something meaningful for that. In fact, the question of trust itself has become a deep problem in science administration, because if you have a scientist in your institution who says, I'm going to take 2 years and think of a great idea, and then the institute has to say, well, I'm going to pay this person 2-3 years salary and let them just do exactly what they want in the hope that they're going to give us something at the end of 2-3 years. So although within the practice of science it is so important, in the relation between science and society, the only way in which we can understand that activity of science is really through trust. And there are very important questions which have risen in recent times, as Shafin points out, that today the technical expertise has many different voices. And within science, within any technical knowledge creation, there are different groups which are saying different things. There are disagreements between the experts. Then what do we as the lay public say? How does the government, where the politicians are allocating funds, which group are they going to align themselves with? What really becomes right and wrong when the public has to intervene, fund, or in any other way continue to allow and support the practice of science? So those are, I think, important questions, which again, if there is some context, we'll come back to later. But I just want to highlight the very important quality of trust, which plays an important role in this. And if you look at what is happening today, it's you can see this in action, and it's I think you can see cynically in action. There's a lot of science mentioned today. It's like I don't mean this in a negative sense, but it's like a bhajan, of science, 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 science. All you have to do is to put on your newscast. I watch, some of these things from our headline news or CNN. It's amazing how much of the narrative of COVID has been about science. People who are not scientists, or these journalists, will say, we want the government to listen to science. They are basically targeting, Trump, for example. So they want to send a message, listen to science, listen to science. It's astounding how much they say. You just have to listen one day in the morning, 3-4 hours, and write down how many times they invoke the word science. And what do they actually mean when they invoke science? And this was actually, I think, became more popular after Greta Thunberg and that protest about the climate change, and where she also, a very feisty activist teenager, says, listen to science. And I was just wondering, what science are you talking about? What is the science we are supposed to listen to? Because if you think of the kind of impact which science and technology has had on the world, if you look at the kind of, the exhaust, the pollution, the excess creation of non-degradable items, and now I think it's one of the next big problem on digital, the digital waste which is being produced, which we don't even see, we don't even have an account of. If you look at all that, one might say that they are products of a scientific society. So what does it mean to say, listen to science if you want to look at the problem of climate change? And, it is right in a sense, but it is also a problem in another sense. I remember well when in my early days at NIAS, I had a very, very good colleague who was an earlier director of the Kalpakkam, atomic plant institute. And he was a metallurgist, a very thoughtful person. And I remember once we were talking about the impact of technologies, particularly in India, where we have had the enormous impact of pollution, industrial pollution, and other forms of pollution, especially on people who have no voice to protest and so on. It's not a history none of us should be proud of. When I was talking to him, he told me something very interesting. He was very committed technocrat. I mean, he thought of the world in terms of technology, and he said, you're right that all these problems have been caused by technology. And he said, therefore, we only can deal with these problems. The solutions also rest with technology. And now you see the reason why, our engagement with technology has to keep growing. And that's, it's a fair argument from his perspective in the way he was seeing. But the larger question here is this, that in such a climate, in such a situation where the world has had what they see as an attack on science. It started with the March for Science across the world. That is not just in India. Like many things in India, we do what some people have already started doing earlier, whether it's in science or social science, or in this case, the March for Science. So it started in many different countries, and many different countries had different things they were asking for. The Indian March for Science is very different. I'm sure many of you have followed the debate on that, so I'm not going to get into that here. But all I'm saying is that there's been a climate over the last few years of a larger public support for science, and the public support, of course, is one has to understand this complexity of the public who supports science. March for Science had some scientists, but I know many scientists who are not part of it. And I can also tell you that there were a very, very large number of scientists who belong to institutions like the DRDO, CSIR, ISRO, some of the biggest of our science institutions in the country, who did not participate in it. And you would find, I would hazard to tell you that you would find very few of them coming out in protest against the government on that. So it's a kind of a selective kind of a position which a few prominent scientists took, and I think it's an extremely important protest. And I support some of their claims, including more funding, etc. But like all ideologies, there may be points of disagreement between us. But this whole question of this public voice for science, you can track something past this March for Science time period till it came to this climate change, this Greta Thunberg's thing, and it now come with Trump, who has aggravated many of the situations about science by being outwardly anti-science or anti-scientific institutions, and definitely anti-science in very many different ways. But I do not want to emphasize the fact that it's anti-science, and this is really the crux of the problem in science and society. I would say it's anti-common sense, or it is anti-thinking. It's just not logical for an ordinary person to say drink a disinfectant, you'll get better from COVID, etc. So but there is a background to which this question has come. And in the time of COVID, the question of trust has also slowly metamorphosed into fear. And this is actually interesting, because I think this is a time in which the question of the relationship between science and religion will come back in a very different way, because many people have argued that traditional religious communities arise within a backdrop of fear. Within a backdrop of fear in the sense, not, you could say the fear of the unknown, fear of the darkness, fear of etc. But, the critiques of religion have often pointed out that many religious rituals and practices are perhaps driven by fear, that we don't know what's going to happen to us tomorrow. Whether that's true or not, you could see that the shift in the two polarities of looking at religion, both from the framework of trust and fear, is also now, I think, very clearly seen in certain aspects of this COVID debate. Because today, the way in which science is being used in this COVID, it's really remarkable. If I look at that picture of that COVID, that virus, with that spherical ball with things protruding out, some people have put red color in it, blue color. It looks, it tries to look, it's frightening sometimes. You want to look at it, you show it to a child in the night, who knows, it child may get nightmares. It visualizes science in a completely different way. And that visualization is not just about trying to understand what the real structures of this universe are, but playing to certain forms of social fear. And that is actually a very important social process which happens within this COVID case. So why then should we continue to talk about the relation between science and society? Is because in India, particularly in India today, government policies on a variety of topics, including environment, water, poverty, education. You look at all these people who are deciding on most of the national the decisions on many of these indices of development and so on. You go and look at who are the members of that, who are the people from society who are present in it, who are the people who have a strong voice in advising the government on what we would think are social issues. And if you find that there is a predominance of scientists in it, then the question you will be asking is, why are scientists so important in deciding major policy issues to do with the larger society? Especially, as some social scientists would say, especially when they do not have the specialized expert domain knowledge that we within these other domains have had, either as social scientists, social work, or the activists and so on, who have a much larger pulse, a much clearer pulse of what is happening in the world around them. What is it that makes a larger state, and what is it that makes a scientific community believe that it can have the answers to very important government policies on all these issues? Again, I think the point here is not to criticize their being there, but point is to understand what does it say about our society What does it say about our society? That we look forward to these people to give us solutions for social issues. And I said it goes back to the question of trust. So it is not just, is it just the question of saying that it's not just that I trust a physicist when she says there are things called black holes and quarks, but I also trust them. I trust her when she says, let's do river linking because it's better in a sense to share water that way. Is it that? Is it just a transfer of trust from scientific knowledge to social practice? Is it that the society, that all of us as lay people have accepted it, or is it that we are so, our inability to act is so much that we really don't even know or we don't even care? So in such a situation, obviously power groups will, become prominent and influence the societies. The other example is, of course, of education, as I'm sure many of you have seen for quite some time now. It's not just the dominance of science education in various ways. When I do the education part, we can talk about it. It is also the fact that many of these documents, very important national policy documents on education, have been driven by scientists, very important scientists. I'm sure we respect all of their capabilities and their commitment to it. But it raises, as I said, larger question about, what is this thing about science that allows people who practice science to become experts in a variety of other social processes on which they can make very important policy decisions. And we know this best in the case of development. And as I said, I won't even go in here because it's such a vast field, but this question right from the beginning, when people have been asking whose voice, whose development is really development about. And as one of the critiques of development, which, and there are, as I said, for all things, there are two sides. But the critiques of development is that much of our development has been so technocratic in spirit that the kinds of social development that we could have envisaged, we have not really had. And I think the COVID really shows how backward we are in very basic indices of social development like healthcare and basic education and basic sanitation, water and food supply to people who cannot afford it. And definitely in the context of all our education, I mean, I don't want to take again the binary, should we be spending on space but not on this? I don't think it is that. As I'm sure many scientists have correctly said, it is not that if you don't put money for space, you're going to go put it for poor people's whatever thing you're going to do, or improving healthcare. So that is not the correct argument. But what is it about the climate of a country that allows policies which are very deterministic in some sense as far as development goes, but has no voice, no sensitivity to various other social parameters, which in reality should be our ways of looking at this relation. Okay, so what I'll do here is to now do this exercise of really trying to clarify what this relation would be, because I know we started a bit late. I wanted to stop. So I think in every session, I'd like to stop for some time so that we can take some questions and so on. I'll do that at the end of this, but I'll stop after this slide to indicate to you how to think about the complexity of this relation, and then we can take it further. So once we accept that there's a relation between science and society, and that there's a need for this relation between science and society for all the reasons we have discussed, we could really ask, how do I then think about it? What do I actually mean by saying a relation between science and society? So I want to show you maybe some ways of unpacking this problem and show maybe, break up the problem in 4 different parts. The first one is to say, well, what I mean by a relation between science and society, because relation is a very vague term. A relation can mean anything. So let me try and break it down so that we have a handle on how to ask this question about what is science and what is society. So the first thing I could say is perhaps that what I mean by saying science and society have a strong relation is to say that there is an influence of science and society. So 2 things are related when one influences the other. And the word influence I'm sure many of our philosophy students here would immediately jump up and say, no, influence is as vague as relation, which is right. But I'm using this term again to suggest to us, since influence is far more common in our usage. Influence could mean causation, for example. You could ask, what are the effects of science on society, for example? So influence, causing, the effects of science on society. So that's one kind of a relation. So the relation, there seem to be two things called science and society, and they both are related, and they're related, one, in the way in which science one object influences the other object, the way in which science influences society. But you could also have a very important part of that relation, or the relation could also be defined by the influence of society on science. That is also a relationship between science and society. And however much we would like to believe science itself is a gated community, like unfortunately, like all science institutes have become, it's extremely difficult for those of us who are not scientists to enter science institutes. But then, it's so difficult to enter into even residential gated communities today. So I suppose that reflects our society more than science. But you could say, even though they seem to be as if they're a set of group of people doing some kind of thinking work and trying to answer problems about the world or whatever, there is still an influence of society on science. So whenever people talk about questions like, why do some countries do so well in science compared to other countries? Why is it? I mean, again, this is a question I really don't like to ask, but I'm just saying this is a rhetorical question, just to point out the significance of this point, right? Although this again is not a very good question to ask. If suppose somebody says, how much of Indian science has impacted upon global science? How much work that we have produced in India over the last whatever years, decades, how much has changed science textbooks? How much new knowledge has been created, which is part of basic science today? And as I said, the real bad question, this is a meaningful question, but the real wrong question is, how many Nobel Prizes have people won in India post-independence for work done in India? I think it's a bad question because it does not reflect on the quality of scientists, because the answer to that is zero, by the way. So it definitely does not reflect on the competence and the hard work which the scientists have done. But some people will try and understand this by saying it is not the scientist's fault, but it is the influence of the society. It's the nature of our society that produces the kind of science that we have produced. And that's, I think a very important point. How does the society function in sometimes very insidious ways, sometimes very much through subterranean, underground ways of influencing how the quality of science, which is produced as a social process, how that is being affected. So that could also be a kind of a relation one could look at. Or you could look at a more stronger relation between science and society by saying it is not just something called science which is influencing something called society, or something called society which is influencing something called science. You could say, well, science itself is a social process. And that there is really, you cannot make such distinctions by saying science and society. Because anything, whatever you call as science, you could be solving one mathematical problem. You could be solving an equation for some in astrophysics. It may look like it is not about your society. Obviously, you're talking about something about, let's say, black hole and object going near it and how much it's going to bend or whatever it is, right? So your scientist might say, well, what does it have to do with the society I live in? It's so far away from our society. Literally, it's so far away from society. It got nothing to do with the society in which we live. It's not about telling you how to build roads and build a sewage system. But that is about individual creativity. It's about individual thinking. And that's the argument, right? That scientists would say, this is just about my imagination, my capacity as a scientist to be able to, write about it, theorize about it, give us ideas about it, etc. What does it have to do with the society? How is it a social process? Okay, and this is, to me, a very important point, which we may have to discuss far more than I'm just presenting it here, we look at the different ways in which science as a social process happens. I'll do a separate talk on that, on how, it's not just about science practice, which is socially influenced. It is also scientific knowledge, which is socially produced, and therefore has deep influences on society. This does not mean, like some people, the moment they hear this, I know a lot of scientists are very allergic to it. I'm also allergic to it, in the sense, if you misinterpret the statement to say that scientific truths are, socially produced truths, in the sense that just because all of us like to think as a community, socially we produce a truth that there is a quark, therefore there is a quark, then that is a kind of a position which is untenable. And we'll look at very good philosophical arguments for and against this. But I'm talking of the larger process of activity of doing science. That doing science in a very fundamental sense is a very specialized social process, belongingness to communities, rituals of action within scientific communities. And by rituals, I don't mean doing puja, like Reni's work shows on Ayuda Puja's work on instruments in scientific labs. I'm not talking about that alone, but various kinds of rituals of doing academic work, including citations, publications, and various other kinds of processes. And science is also a social process, because the kind of concepts and knowledge you receive, the kind of confidence that you have to work on different kinds of questions, they're all dictated by our social influences. So this is another meaning of the relation which can be explored far more deeply, which we will do later on. And you could also have another way of looking at this relation between society and by science, by looking at society itself as being scientific. Now, this is, of course, a very problematic claim. Some people would immediately say, how is society is not scientific? That seems to be very obvious. But that claim itself is a very interesting claim, and we need to look at the ideas of the meanings of the word science and society and ask the question, what do you want us to be if you want us to be scientific? So when all the media people are saying, listen to science about the COVID, what is it about science that they are saying we should listen to? Is it about the structure of the virus, the protein structure in it, the nano angstrom unit length of these objects? Or is it about larger ideas of notions of evidence and so on, which may not be restricted to science, which may be part of larger social rationalities? So when decisions are made at government policy level, policies which are scientific in character, let's say, for example, for solving problems related to water or to poverty, then you could ask a question, is it that you want to convert social processes into scientific processes? And if so, what are the implications? What are the strengths of doing this? What are the weaknesses of doing it? And this, has always been a point of debate within the social sciences. But just by saying society is scientific is not enough, because society is made up of many different parts, which we will look at later. And we also look at what is science. So we could say, do you want all social action to be scientific? So you might remember, some of you might remember this debate in which I'm sure some of us were involved, which is about the question about scientific temper. And the claim by some people, some scientists in India, that if you are scientific, whatever it meant, then you would not have caste problems in the country, that you can eradicate caste by having scientific temper. Okay, so, there have been many discussions around it. I'll come, when I talk about science and caste and gender, we'll talk about it a little bit more. What they're basically saying here is that social processes, social structures can be made scientific. And if there are any problems in society, it is because they're unscientific. And creating processes which are scientific, creating policies which are scientific, will lead us to a better society. And that is, I think, a valid claim till we find ways to understand it, critique it, strengthen it, defend it, whatever. You could also ask the question, when we say society is scientific, does it mean all members of a society should do science? When people, and again, I'm going to say this later, but let me mention it again here, since there are many new people in this audience, so you may not have heard this before. Indian Constitution expects all of us as Indian citizens to have something called scientific temper. It's our constitutional duty for every Indian citizen to possess what is called scientific temper. Great. What does it mean to have scientific temper? What does it mean for the poorest to the richest to have so-called scientific temper? Is it by studying science that we have scientific temper? Which obviously would mean that all our scientists have scientific temper, whether they support the right, the left, the whatever they support, or they take positions which are regressive, either in terms of caste or gender, which the science community is known for. Would that be scientific? So what is it that makes us possess the scientific temper? Is it by doing science? Is it by doing more of science? Does that influence our science education policies, by the way? Or is the very idea of science itself something which needs to be placed before a larger public of social scientists, humanities scholars, and the working public? I'm not least interested in a small group of academicians deciding what science is. There are millions of people around the country who, to me, practice science in their day-to-day work, in the crafts that they do, in terms of their handwork that they do, in terms of their thinking capacities, in terms of their rational capacities when confronted with some of the worst social horrors around them, like many activists. Without taking positions of right, left, and science and non-science, etc., or even science and religion, there are millions of them who, to me, belong to this world of scientific thinking, in the sense they don't know Newton's laws of motion or Einstein's theory of relativity, and they won't be able to solve a quadratic equation. But they are involved in a process of reasoning and rationality, which goes very deep into understanding human actions and social processes. So this question about, if we want society to be scientific, what exactly are we asking for? That's something which we will think together and see whether we can make any progress on that. And then, of course, finally, the question which I will try and answer later on is that, what does it actually mean when I say the word science, society, or science? Okay. Do you have some more time, Ritesh? Hello, Ritesh, can you hear me?
Yes, Sundar. Yeah. Yes, we have
some. I'm not able to see the screen, the Zoom screen, unless there are very specific questions, because we have another 15 minutes. I can either do this for another 5-10 minutes and look at the questions, or what do we do?
Yeah, I think there are a few questions that have come up.
Okay.
Perhaps we can take some of them.
Okay.
I mean, is it a good point where we could engage with some discussion?
In 10 minutes, then just that I don't know why my Zoom, I can't see anything. I mean, it's become a small window where I can't. But anyway, that's all right.
So how
do I do?
Would you want to go?
You can tell me the thing, perhaps.
Okay.
The questions, if you like, or
right. So I'm just scrolling onto the chat to figure
out. Now I opened it. Sorry, I got it open now. I'll look at it very quickly. As I said, I'll definitely take these questions and we'll build on them. So what I'll do is, I may not take all of them right now, and let me factor this in when we start next week. I mean, on Friday, the next session on Thursday, because I can see there's been a large number of questions and comments. So I'll definitely pick up this and we'll work with that. I will just at least try and connect them together to what we are saying. Okay, let me just, then since we have about 10 minutes, let me just see if there's anything so urgent, and if people are very upset about something, then I can try And C, relationship with civil society and science. Yes, so we will
I
come
think,
to
sir,
that.
it starts from, Sneha's question.
Yeah.
Is there a relation between the absence of dedicated humanities institute in India
Uh,
uh, with the absence of science studies institutes?
uh,
So is it the
dedicated
absence
what?
of
Sorry.
dedicated humanities institute in India
Yeah.
with the absence of science studies institute?
Okay, so yeah, so let me yeah, let maybe address this question. I know, as I said, on the education thing, we'll come back to this in greater detail. See, the point about science studies is this, and the point is not, it's very sad that the science community in India thinks for those who study science, like I'm talking about very non-threatening disciplines like history of science and philosophy of science. I can understand sociology of science; they will always have a little bit of problem. The larger community itself has had this problem with sociology of science, but philosophy of science, let's face it, they're very largely, you know, if I want to say things which is not very positive, I would say for quite a bit of philosophy of science is, a very poorer cousin of science. It's a pseudo science, a kind of support waving, flag waving for science in some sense. A very critical understanding of what is happening in science is a very, does not mean it's critical of science. And I know the reason I'm saying this is because in societies in which we have had fantastic science being done, you also have fantastic humanities and social science being done. You go to some of the top universities we often talk about, I don't know, UK, US, the Harvard, Oxford, whatever. Your physics department will be as good as the maths department, as good as the sociology department, and as good as the philosophy department, or the arts and the music department, or the literature department. Here we have created an ecosystem where one, we have systematically devalued any other larger notions of education, which very surprisingly, all of them feed into doing of good science, by the way. And that's what I've been, screaming for so many years to no avail. That good science, I'm saying this not as a critique of science, I'm saying this in order to produce good science. Good science needs good intellectual capabilities ranging from theater to music to mathematics to sociology to philosophy, etc. The other problem so that's definitely a major issue. That's immediately a first major issue there. The second problem is that, so we have also had very weak humanities education, etc. So, that has had its own circular processes. But when it comes to science studies, when people who wanted to start a program, independent programs in philosophy of science, history of science, etc., it's been very difficult because the places where there is money and so on have been the science institutes. In fact, look at this very odd situation we are in today. you know, some of the best humanities department in the country are not in universities. They've all been put under science institutes. It started with the IITs, now the IISers. They all have good money, much better money than many of the other private institutions have or public state universities have. And so what happens is you place all your best science, study of science institutes, humanities and social science people within the HSSC groups in, humanities and social science groups, HSS departments, all the major science institutes which are very well funded and in which they always have a very hierarchical relationship. I know examples in IITs and IISers. I know there are very good people, and I think the IISers particularly are excellent models of teaching science. But I know for a fact through many personal examples that hiring of humanities and social science scholars are often done by scientists sitting in the panel who decide on whether you're competent as a philosopher, sociologist, or a political science or whatever. And there's nothing. The society doesn't have anything to say about it. The science community has nothing to say about it. I'm saying it is a science community which should be asking for an autonomous institutes which do science studies in India, which will look at history of science in the best possible sense, which will look at philosophy of science in its best possible sense, not as critique alone, but in terms of strengthening what does it mean to do good science in India? And the worst part of it, in my view, in my own personal experience of many years of being in an institute which has been largely run by scientists, which was a great experiment on humanities and social science initiative, is that for scientists, many, I'm not saying all, as I said, I have very good friends among science community. I know many people in the science community whom I respect very deeply. I think they're very broad-based. They have excellent, they have thought about things in across domains, etc. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about people, especially in science administration, science leadership, etc., who do not have the respect of the knowledge systems of the social science and humanities. So one of the reasons why science institutions have not developed, science studies has not developed in India, is because it is scientists, mainly after they are retired or after they have finished their major work in whatever discipline they are in, who then now begin to do things like history of science, science education, science communication, and so on. And the irony of this is that because there is no funding, I mean, I've been member of ICPR, I've tried getting funds from ICPR, ICSSR to run just outreach courses. It's so difficult. There's no money anywhere. These retired scientists can get money from science institutions like the Department of Science and Technology. I shouldn't be saying this in public, but I think it's good to say this because it's about science and society. We should really be looking at how is the scientific funding being distributed? In what kind of social accountability do they have? So because these people come from the particular domain, they're able to get funds to do things which they want in fields in which professionals in those fields will not get, including, by the way, science and art initiatives. And I think all of us know examples of where that's being done and the money which they can get for it. So it is, I think, the source of the problem. And the source of the problem is also that if people get away from looking at science studies as an anti-science, that itself, I think, is such an important step. Because we are only making a simple point that people who do certain kinds of things are not necessarily ones who can look at it in the fullness of it. For example, just because I drive a motorbike does not mean I'm a good mechanic or I even know how to use the motorbike. I don't even know how the damn thing works. But I can be a very good driver. I can just zoom around everywhere. So just because you're a good scientist, what other qualities do you need in order to understand the nature of science, in order to understand science and society? Look at science and society as a theme. As I said, this is now the biggest, probably the money in India you can get on science and society will be from INSA, the Indian National Science Academy. I don't know how many of you are not within science in this group, but any of you try and send them a project to get money for it and let's see how you get it. Or who are the people who are going to decide whether that's worth you doing that thing on science and society? Because it's the scientists who are in the INSA who are deciding on what is a good, worthwhile science and society project, right? And that's government money, by the way. So where do you go then to work on any of these questions? And as I said, these questions are not about saying decrease. In fact, science society, science studies will lead to richer science policies, which will put pressure on government to generate more funds, fund science better in India, start more institutions. There are enormous number of very bright young scientists who are not getting the kind of support they should in terms of the freedom of work, in terms of money that they need, etc. So these come from a very rich ecosystem which can look at different disciplines like history, philosophy, and sociology of science and technology and teach courses about it, develop professionals in it, and so on, which is how all academic disciplines develop. So definitely I would say, that is, I think, been a major problem, but we will have to see how best to deal with it, Okay, so yeah, so I have many more of these questions. So I'll definitely pick up on this, maybe some of them tomorrow. Should I just conclude my final points of it and then we can, how you want to go ahead? What do you say, Ritesh?
I guess that would be nice because if we have some concluding thoughts,
Yeah,
and
I'll
then
just
we
leave
can
with this
take up the
concluding
questions.
thoughts. Yeah, and I'll pick up all the questions. I mean,
They're really interesting questions
definitely
out
will.
there.
Yeah, I know. I also saw it briefly, and I think we need to engage with it. So maybe the next session we'll begin with those questions, so that I'll try and set up a framework for them. Some of them I'll be answering down the line, which I'll mention, and then we will see how to do this further. Okay. So what I'll do? Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea.
Okay. So let me just end with this problem so you can think about it by the time we come back after tomorrow. Is that okay? So these are all the ways of excuse me, looking at the relationship between science and society. What exactly does a relation mean, etc. Fine. But I just want to flag two quick problems which we can keep in mind as a source of this problem, right? And so maybe we can think about it and see how it comes back in the next lectures that we are going to listen to. The first problem when we talk about a relation between science and society is that it's very abstract, because both science and society are both abstract. I don't know what you actually mean by science and what do you mean by society. There are many elements within science. There are many elements within society. There is no homogeneous community called scientists. Not just, it's not that, it's not to say that the people in the physics department is different from chemistry, mathematics, or engineering departments and so on. That is okay. That is known. But I'm saying even substantially, the way they look at a problem, the way they approach a problem, the way they solve a problem, the way they think about that issue are very radically different in different disciplines. The specialized knowledge is so different from different disciplines. The hierarchy of disciplines in India have often been remarked upon, and I'm not the first one to do it, and there have been enough scientists who themselves point out the hierarchy which exists between various disciplines within an institution. And engineering really pays a big price in comparison to in the hierarchy with the so-called pure sciences. So there are many meanings of the word. There are many elements, components of the idea of word science. And similarly, there are many components of the word society. As I said, society could be individuals, it could be a collection, it's a social, various things. And I will do one separate session on the relationship between the natural and the social. There is such a close relationship because both science and society, I mean, there's a lot of it is part of our book with Gopal Guru, which came out a few months back, called Experience, Caste and the Everyday Social. So those of you who are interested can look at some part of it. But we will look at how, the idea of nature and natural, which is so important for science, has a very strong analog within the idea of the social and its relationship to society. So science and society are both abstract. When we say science and society, a relationship between them, we are just relating two very vague, abstract things, right? So that's why many times we talk at cross purposes, because somebody is meaning something else. They are meaning physicists who are saying something, and somebody else is saying engineers who are saying something else, and so on. So, so I just want, the first problem I want to highlight to you is, when you have abstract things and the idea of relation itself is abstract, one embodiment, one critical material representative is present, and that is a scientist. The scientist is the fulcrum of a relation between science and society in one way. So like we saw the 4 different relations between science and society, we could also understand this as the embodiment. That is, since science and the society are abstract and they are very diverse and diffused, there is a very crucial link which binds this question of science and society, and that is a scientist. Because the scientist holds the identity card of both the science institute and of the society. So holds both the entry institute into IISc and also a passport of Indian society. And passport also into his or her caste belonging, gender, all these other issues, religious belongingness, etc. So the scientist as the material representative both in science and society is very important. We need to know how to address this question, because in the history of science, especially in the question of science and ethics, people have often taken the position that, look, let's not worry about the scientist. Science is about truth. Science is about nature. Science is not really worried about making a bomb or not making a bomb. It is, the scientist, the bad scientist or the bad politician is doing it, which is fine, which is a correct argument.
Although when we discuss a bit more on ethics, we'll see the complexity of this argument. But the crucial thing is the scientist is the material representative of both science and society. So how do we use this to understand the relationship between science and society? Without putting the burden on the scientist. Like a very good physicist friend of mine told me, he said, you're asking us to do everything. We just want to do science. You're now saying we are the cause of this, we have to do science education, you're this and that. So we just want to do our science, which is very correct. So we cannot burden them as carrying the problems of society or the representation of society, but that interface shows you a very interesting relationship. It shows you a very interesting dynamic between science and society. And you can see that in Indian science very clearly. And I'll look at very specific examples as we go along. So just like, borrowing a statement of from philosophy of art, which is art is what artists do, we could say, in a true sense of the word, science is what scientists do. And when scientists say something is not science, it is not science. However much philosophers of science will want to keep shouting, no, it is following all the tenets of science, etc. And that is an extremely important point about that. It's a very social articulation of science. And I'll just stop with this last question, which is another problem. So I'm raising two problems in this, the kinds of questions which arise in this problem. And this is an extremely deep problem. I'll pick it up later. I'm just stating it here and leave it here. Which is this point, like when we say science and society, does science influence society? Does society influence science? We seem to be acting under the assumption that science and society are two different entities. And that somehow they are, one is outside something, science is outside society, therefore influencing it. Scientists are doing something not belonging to regular society and influencing it, etc. Or that society is outside science and trying to control science, etc. How correct is this? Can we even understand a picture like this, that science and society are in some kind of a synchronic or a diachronic relationship? They're either parallel relationship, or that one comes first and one drives the other. Something is before the other. And you might say, well, I don't think that is the way. So we know who thinks that science and society are different, etc. And the answer to that, the reason I'm posing this question is because to me, this is one of the most important problems in Indian science, or science in India, right? Doing science in India, which is a very much present, may not always be articulated point that science is not part of our society. Okay, that's best exemplified by the constitutional duty towards scientific temper. We do not have it in our tradition. And what is scientific temper for? Scientific temper is to help you get rid of superstitious belief and traditions, blind beliefs and superstition. It is to pull people from their caste beliefs, religious beliefs. And why do you need science to do that? Because science is something outside as a tool, which is not present within your own traditional cultural practices. And therefore, you need to bring in science in order to pull you out of your cultural practices. And the implication, a very simple conclusion from that, therefore, science is not part of our society. Much of the problem in Indian context arises from this extremely difficult question about the relationship between science and pre-colonial Indian societies. I don't want to say traditional, cultural, classical, etc. Pre-colonial Indian societies. And there's not one Indian society. So to all social science students, we know this, we often say this, so I'm repeating it. So I'm using the word society in the singular, but I mean it as plural. India, multiple societies of various kinds. It's one nation now, but it's multiple societies. And that when we say that you need scientific temper to reform the society, you are saying that the pre-colonial societies did not have the capacity for possessing science, whatever that means. This is extremely important because the colonial discourse is based on this. This is the colonial discourse in one line. It is what Mills writes about Indian society. It is what all the great philosophers, especially the German philosophers and the British empiricists who write this about Indian rational traditions, including Indian philosophy, Indian logic, later on about Indian mathematics, and so on. So it is a question which we need to understand, because we know that it's been appropriated by the right to say that pre-colonial ancient India was very scientific. And there's a constant, I think it's just a meaningless fight people are having about whether this was scientific then or it is scientific now. Very interestingly, we must note that in many accounts, even within philosophical journals, when people talk about Aristotle and Plato, there is very little qualification given to them when you talk about them, their view as science, as being part of a scientific worldview. Although it is Aristotle's fundamental mistakes, profound mistakes, as Jammer points out, there are 5 major mistakes of Aristotle about the natural world, including a theory of motion, of a space, and emptiness, and so on, which had to be overthrown for modern science to be possible. So you can see why there is a larger colonial politics in this, but this is an important question because it drives a very important history of science. It drives a major marker in Indian traditions. In various study of Indian societies, because if science is seen as external to Indian societies, and if the so-called tribals and the poor people are not scientific, whatever that means, then we have to go educate them with your formal school system, because you want to bring them up to what you think you as your educational system can give them. You are going to teach them scientific temper when they want to sit under trees or whatever it is. So this leads, what I'm trying to say is, without taking a position right now on this, I think we need to understand this before we take a position, that the notions of scientific temper, the debate between tradition and between, Indian society and science as an export which comes from outside as a tool to reform society, that has become so integral to Indian psyche. And forget about whether it's right or wrong. I'm saying that this psyche, and I'm saying something which my scientist friends may not agree with, I'm saying that it is this psyche that science is external and needs to come to us from outside, that has also inhibited great science developing in India. Forget about history and philosophy of science. Great science, good science produced in India is also inhibited by the fact this larger cultural lack of thinking. You come from a world of practice and whatever practices, culture, which does not have science within it. And that comes through an extremely naive understanding of what is science. So what I'll do in the next session. So in fact, this is an extremely important part, debate on history of science and whether there was science in other civilizations, not just India, of course, China, Africa, etc. The Middle East, the Arabic philosophers are the most important contributors to the creation of modern science, in the first millennia. And we don't see them anywhere here in the story of the modern development of science. So we need to look at these larger questions of history of science. So in the next session, I'll begin with clarifying how to understand certain aspects of science. What is special to science? And there is something very special to science. So we look at a little bit of the philosophy of science to see what is special to science and see how those might enter into relationship with the larger society. Okay. Sorry if we went a few minutes off, but I thought we started a bit late. So, yeah, so I look at those questions. I don't know if you want to, and I'll definitely get back to many of them and respond.
Yeah, sorry, I have saved these questions on the chat and we have access to them. So I'll share it with you. However, there have been a couple of hand raises, and one of the participants, Subru, wanted to describe the question. Is it okay if we can take the questions in the later session? Because it's around.
Sure. I mean, no, it's up to you, because I don't know if people want to leave or sit or whatever it is that they want to do. I'm fine with answering.
So perhaps we can take a couple of hand raises which have there.
Okay. Yeah.
One by Durga and one by Nazia.
Okay.
And I think if it's not too long, then we can stop over there.
Sure.
And Shubhro, sorry, because he has been raising it. So three questions, and then we'll stop over there. Is that
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
That's
I
okay
would
with us.
I would request Durga, Nazia, and Subhro to be brief in their questions or comments. Thank you. Nazia, would you want to start?
Shubhro, you may ask your question now.
Yeah, is it audible?
Yes, it is.
Yes, you are on.
I had a brief question that was mainly in relation to the contemporary situation that we are facing, not COVID-19, but also related to the infrastructural concerns of Indian government. So, like you are talking about, and you have written for a long time about the colonial unfolding of the question of science and the pre-colonial concerns of let's say in generally the contested knowledge productions, whether we talk of and the multiple ways in which uh, our interpretation of past has always continued to travel in problematic ways to the present. But in that relation, if I talk of now, the present government, it seems it's a kind of a curious scenario where, whereas in public spaces, ideologically limited role of science is something which is encouraged, whereas critical thinking is something which is moving more into private spaces with funding. So whereas in the government spaces, public spaces, funding is encouraged more for certain ideologically colored understanding of science and scientific role or scientific community, whereas more detailed critical questioning is something which is moving into the private spaces, private capital, and their own way of giving that freedom and accessibility to question or think in that way. So in that relation, if I talk of caste or minority or marginalized communities, it seems a certain strategic exclusion is working in terms of what we talk about scientific temperament or enhancing scientific temperament, building scientific approach or critical thinking. So how do you think, like do you think that the only way to respond to this kind of crisis is organizing autonomous small groups like you had started with Barefoot Philosophers or others? Barefoot, I like the name when I got the mail for the first time, without funding, those barefoot, that. So do you think that this is the only way of countering or like sticking against this kind of a rising wave that is coming?
No, I mean, okay, the last point I can say, I really think, I'm a strong believer in institutions and building institutions. Institutions are the way to build societies. They play a very important role. But the problem is we have had massive failure of leadership in institutions, including science institutions. And if you are within a science institute, you will know the kind of questions that come from the leadership of the people who are working there, the kind of problems that they have. We have to find ways to do that, because the question of patronage and feudal and loyalty and psychophancy exists in our institute, is the institutional culture in terms as far as leadership goes, and that is part of the problem. So I'm sure I'm doing Barefoot also because to get philosophy to children, because I thought how much to teach these adults, they're not getting it. So maybe try and teach the children, do more philosophy for them. But the point is that no, we need very good, well-defined, good institutions. And it's not that our people don't know. If you look at our science community, many of them, most of them now, have studied in the best institutes around the world, and they are working here in India. And they're not able to duplicate some of those things, although they know how to do it. What is the problem? So we need to look at aspects of creating better institutional culture in everything, including in politics and governance, and that's going to be a bit of a challenge. And I think that's where the larger public has a role to play about our understanding of science. And we have not touched upon the question of medical science at all, which I will do later. That's an extremely important entry point for this. Ritesh,
Would you want to take up the next? Because
sure.
I see
Yeah.
hand raised by Nazia.
Yeah.
I don't think she's.
Okay.
Yeah. So perhaps we can take a look at all the questions later in the next
I'll do
session.
that. Yeah. Can you make sure it's, I mean, whatever you save it, and
Yeah.
we will do the, huh?
Okay. Okay.
All right.
Yeah, I must register my sincere thanks because it has been a long session and you have been through to the session until the end, and you've also been taking questions.
No, it's
Very exhausting.
our classes are all 3 to 4 hours, so this is a very short session for me.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
And I
Thanks
must
so much.
thank the audience for being so supportive and the overwhelming support that we have received from the audience. We'll
And I
try
hope you
to
start at
attend to the classes.
5:30, right? Day after? I hope you
Yes,
start on
yes,
time. Yeah.
yes. We'll try and do that.
Great. Okay.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.